Me and my wife worked really hard in order to save 20% down on a house that we were going to buy. But along the way, we learned so much about money that totally switched our perspective on what we're going to do with this cash. Today, I'm going to share with you those insights, and then I'm going to walk you through the different reasons why, even with 20% down saved, we're still not buying a house. The first thing that we learned that really switched our perspective on this whole plan was the idea that this house is not an asset. What we learned along the way is that an asset is something that makes you money, and a liability is something that takes money away from you. So an index fund investment is an asset because over time it slowly makes you more money, while a car is a liability because the money that you spent on the car initially slowly dwindles away with time. But there's something in between these two that most people call a hedge against inflation. And the items that would fall in this category are things that do make you money, but they only make you enough money to actually keep up with inflation. So in the end, it's just a zero-sum game. One example of a hedge against inflation is gold, but another example of a hedge against inflation is the housing market. When you buy a private residence for yourself, it's something that will increase in value about 3% every year, which makes it just barely in line with inflation. Now, there are lots of nuances to this discussion. I think about the fact that most people are using levered debt in order to purchase a house, which would mean that it's a little bit more of an asset if your interest rate is low enough. And while that might make it more of an asset, I also think about the maintenance fees that go into owning a house that if you rent, you just aren't responsible for. The bottom line is that every realtor's favorite line is that renting is just paying somebody else's mortgage, and renting is throwing money away. But when you actually sit down and do the math, this couldn't be further from the truth. When you compare purchasing a house by using a mortgage and investing in the S&P 500, the difference between the 3% return you make in the housing market and the 10% return you make in the market, that difference is astronomical. While the S&P 500 is a true asset that uses your money to make more money, at best the housing market is a hedge against inflation. The second thing that we learned is that renting is a cheat code to wealth. Me and my wife live in a high cost of living area where to buy a single family standalone house costs anywhere north of $750,000. But to buy an apartment or a condo costs somewhere around $550,000 to $650,000. And thankfully, our rent is just incredibly low. And that's really for two reasons. The first is that he's a private owner that we rent from, and the second reason is that we do all of our own maintenance. We've literally redone the plumbing in the kitchen sink, fixed his toilet on multiple occasions, fixed the closet doors as they were falling off, and all sorts of random things that we learned off of YouTube. Regardless, the difference in the monthly expenditures between us renting this condo and us purchasing a house and having a mortgage and all the other expenses that come along with that is about $2,300 a month. But here's the kicker. What we do with that $2,300 a month changes everything. And what we're doing with this money is we're investing it into the S&P 500, which over a 30-year period, accounting for the 20% down that we would have put into the house in the first place, that money will make $7.3 million. By contrast, if we had instead taken that money and bought the house with it, over that same 30-year timeline, we would have made about $1.46 million. Meaning that the difference between renting over that 30-year period and buying over the same period is almost $6 million. Now, that doesn't include the hidden costs of ownership, which is significant, but it also doesn't include the rent hikes because that varies so much from renter to renter. Now, we're not going to rent for 30 years, and I hope you don't have to either, but the point still stands. Now, perhaps your situation is different. Maybe you don't live in a high cost of living area. Maybe you need the extra space, or maybe you just want to commit to a particular neighborhood. These are perfectly wise reasons to buy a house, but the common excuse that renting is throwing money away was made up by your real estate agent and is nowhere near mathematically sound. The big caveat in this whole conversation is you need to make sure that you have the discipline to invest the difference. Dave Ramsey's position on this is entirely based on the fact that he doesn't believe the average person has the discipline to actually invest that difference. So make sure before you go about this route that you make sure that you have the discipline to actually invest the difference when you choose to rent instead of buy. The third lesson we learned is that the American dream is not a biblical one. The biggest lie that I hear in Christianity about money is that the Bible has nothing to say about money. But 11 of the 39 parables in the Gospels talk about the subject of money. And 1 in every 7 verses of Jesus' words talk about money too. The world says if you're renting, you're losing. And to buy a home is the dream that we all have and we all share. But the Bible challenges us to go so much deeper than that when it comes to our money. that it's not about reaching some sort of American dream, it's about being wise and prudent with the money that God gives us. 1 Corinthians 4:2 says that moreover it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. For me and my wife, as much as we want the benefits and the joys of homeownership and hope to experience that down the line, we want much more than that to be prudent and wise with the money that God's given us. If you're liking this content, please like and subscribe so I can keep making videos like this one. The fourth lesson we learned along the way was something that was kind of shocking, and that was that we're actually pretty darn content where we're at. Hebrews 13:5 says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. A big misconception about financial contentment is that it means that you shouldn't have any goals or any desires. But Philippians chapter 4, verse 11 says, I have learned what it means to be content in all circumstances. But the Greek word for that word content is autarkes, and it doesn't mean to be without want. It means to be joyful and sufficient in all circumstances. So in our circumstance, we really want a house, but we are totally joyful for what God has given us in this season, and we feel that it is completely sufficient. The next thing we learned was that renting offers you a flexibility that owning a mortgage could never. Honestly, as a renter, it really doesn't feel like there's a ton of flexibility in renting either. But compared to purchasing a house, it's definitely a step up. Owning a home always decreases flexibility, but especially in a high interest rate environment where you have to own your house for 5 to 7 years to make any sort of sense of the purchase in the first place, renting certainly gives you the ability every single year to decide, is this still the place we want to live? I have a friend who bought his house 3 years ago, and I recommended to him dozens of times that he should rent instead of buy because he knew he wasn't going to be in the area very long. Well, now we're at that point in time where he's thinking about leaving the area, and the weight of the decisions of whether to sell for a loss or rent it out, increasing his workload every week, have made this move so much more difficult. For me and my wife, we just don't know where God would have us. We hope to stay in the area because we love the church that I'm working at, but neither one of our families are here, and that makes the idea of raising children in the area pretty difficult. But because we don't know where God would have us in the next 5 to 10 years, the flexibility that renting gives us makes it a no-brainer. But what are me and my wife doing instead? I wouldn't want this conversation to be a discouragement to you because maybe you've spent the last several years saving up 20% down so you can finally buy a house. And maybe me showing you the other side of the coin is not really encouraging, but more discouraging. So what I think will encourage you is me sharing with you what me and my wife are doing with that money instead. So we are renting and we are investing the difference, but our goals are the same as yours. We truly want to buy a house. But given all the variables I just shared with you in this video, it just doesn't make sense right now. And the reality is the longer we wait, the bigger our investments get and the more options that we'll have when we actually get to that point of purchasing a house. If you like this video, YouTube thinks you'll like this video as well. So click here and I'll see you there.